The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. This is Tom Pyzdek of the Pyzdek Institute. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar conducted by Larry Dyer, a Pyzdek Institute Master Black Belt. Larry's going to talk to us about the science and art of facilitation. So Larry, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay. Can you see my screen, Tom?
I think we will in just a second. Here it is.
Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about facilitation. And for myself, I've probably done somewhere between 40 and 50 Kaizens. And what we typically have to do when we do these Kaizens, our organization is spread all over the United States. So we typically have to pull a group of people together in a single location, try to make as much progress as we can in 3 to 3.5 days, and then everybody goes home and you have to manage things remotely to get the projects completed. So I've done a lot of reading over the years and kind of refined this technique that I use to facilitate these kinds of meetings to get things done quickly. So hopefully you'll enjoy it. So we're going to talk about what is facilitation, why it's needed, some of the common meeting problems that people have, what are the characteristics of a good facilitator, a little bit about the group dynamics, how groups develop, how do we keep the meetings on track, and then there's some pitfalls and time savers. I just threw those in at the end. I probably won't go into a lot of detail on those, but they're just there for your reference material. People are always asking me, what happens when this situation occurs or this situation? So I tried to put some of those at the end so that you guys could use that as reference material. So facilitate, to make easier or less difficult, or I like to assist the progress of. And then facilitation, lowering the resistance in a neural pathway to an impulse. I like that. I thought that was good. So that's what we're going to be talking about, is facilitate and facilitation as we go through this. So the facilitator is the person who is moving the group along and identifies and solves problems and makes decisions. Now, Roger Schwartz wrote a book called The Skilled Facilitator, and if you don't have that, I would recommend that you add that to your reading list. It's a real good book about facilitation. It also has strong components of project management into that, which turn out to be some of the things you need as a skilled facilitator anyway. So why is facilitation needed? Well, look at the top scenario. This represents the old way of interacting with teams. You come together, then you go your separate ways. Sometimes people don't understand what they need to do. There's no complete understanding, really. Eventually they come back together, reset expectations, then you go gather data, and then the data must be organized and usually reorganized. Then the teams have to review and analyze the data in order to reach some sort of agreement. And then they go back to their organization, and the project manager's pressing them to get their things done. And in the end, no one's really sure exactly what's collected. And, oh, by the way, it took a long time. So the facilitated approach brings everybody together early to develop operational definitions. So we want to make sure that everybody that pulls together has a complete understanding of what it is we're trying to do. And this is really the only way to ensure understanding across the group. Next, they can go gather data and do any required analysis, but when the team gets back together, there's a shared understanding of the result, and this is a much faster process. So why is it needed? Well, the tangible benefits are we need to reduce scope creep. Typically what happens when you pull these groups and meetings together, most of you that have done Six Sigma projects understand that scope creep is something we deal with all the time. Oh, while you're fixing this, can you fix this? And so you really need to have boundaries around what it is you're trying to solve so that you can keep that scope creep to a minimum. Accelerates early learning. That's what the operational definitions bring to it, is we're getting everybody up to speed early in the process so that they can be productive very quickly. and reduces the overall time of the project. The intangible benefits, so you're developing these working relationships as you pull this team together. And what you want to do is you want the team to gel quickly so that you can get to a result quickly. Plus, the team has ownership of the results. You don't have to sell the results. The team becomes the sales staff for the results. So they've got ownership of it, and it improves the implementation, speeds the implementation. They're the ones that will go back. They become like your super users that go back and spread the news of the results of what you solved here. So here's a quote from Mary Bush. You can do a project without facilitation, but you can also cut your own hair and do your own dentistry. It just takes longer, it's more painful, and you probably won't get the best results. Project managers can get results without facilitation, but they're taking a risk that it will take longer and will involve a learning curve they may not have time for. So I thought that was a great quote about why you need facilitation. So what are some of the common meeting problems that you see? Now, I've listed some on here that I see, and if any of you have comments you'd like to share, you can send those to Tom, and he'll read those off for us. But keeping people on topic is one of the big challenges that you have to deal with. Violent agreement is another one that I've seen where you have people that are very vocal in speaking what it is they want to say, and then when they get finished, you realize they were in agreement, and here they were in argumentative mode, but they were their results were in agreement. I mean, it's amazing. So I usually try to laugh that off and say, oh, you're just in violent agreement, and then move on from there. Too much talk, too little deciding. Agree with different definitions. That's where the operational definitions come into play, because I've had people that are arguing about a particular point, and what they have is they have a different definition of one word, and that causes them to be to not agree. So what you have to do is you have to, as a facilitator, you have to kind of understand that and take that apart and find out which of those words they're having difficulty or they don't have agreement on.
Larry?
Yeah.
Can I give you an example of that?
Absolutely.
I think it applies. This is Tom Pyzdek. I was once working with a hospital, and they were trying to reduce the cesarean section rate. We had a team that had been working on it for several months, and no progress had been made. So we brought in a facilitator, and it happened to be that he was also a senior leader in the company, so he had a lot of influence with the group. And I noticed we were in a U-shaped seating arrangement and the physicians had arranged themselves on one side of the table, and the nurses and staff had arranged themselves on the other side. And the administrator was standing up, and he wrote down the mission of the team. And the mission of the team as written was to reduce the rate of cesarean sections in our hospital. And he said, do you agree on this definition? And all of the physicians shook their head no, and all the others shook their head yes. And after about 15 minutes of discussion, they inserted one additional word that brought everybody into an agreement. And instead of reduce the rate of cesarean sections, it was reduce the rate of unnecessary cesarean sections. And that word had really kept that team from making progress for months.
That's a good example, Tom. Now, I've seen similar examples in my experience where you have the team, actually when you're just looking at the problem statement, and a lot of times we'll just open this by looking at the problem statement and the goal statement, the way we define it in our charter, and we'll not have agreement on the problem statement, and we'll have to work through that first before we can make progress. So it's really important, though, that you get through that operational definition part and make sure that you've got everybody in agreement. So what is a good facilitator? Well, you can't take anything personally. You have to disconnect from the group from that point of view. But you've got to remain objective throughout the life of the meeting. And you ask questions to foster clarity. So a lot of times what I'll do when I'm in one of these meetings is just for my own understanding, I'll ask questions to try to understand exactly what it is they're talking about. And what I find out later is that there are other people in that session that didn't know that information either. But I was the one that asked the question. They didn't speak up. So ask questions to foster clarity. Don't suggest solutions. The only time that I would go against that is if you have a project and you've worked with the sponsor and the sponsor has said, I want to make sure that they evaluate this as one of the possible solutions. And from that point of view, I have inserted suggestions for solutions. But typically, you don't. Guide the group instead of dictating, remain objective. I think I said that. I guess I really wanted to make that point. Allow the group to make the decisions contrary to your opinion. So you have to be careful when you're leading a group to make sure that your body language stays objective too. For example, when someone makes a comment and you raise your eyebrows, that can be construed as you're feeling contrary to that decision. So you have to be very careful of that. And then manage the group politics without fear of reprisal. So you have to manage the politics of the group, and you have to make sure that people have an opportunity to speak. But remember, the facilitator is there to focus on the meeting process, not contributing directly to the results of the meeting. So how do groups develop? Well, I'm sure most of you have seen this. This is right out of Tom's book about forming, storming, norming, and performing. The thing about pulling a team together and making progress quickly is you have to get through these stages quickly. You're going to go through the stages unless you've had this team together on a previous project and they've already figured out how to perform. But when you're pulling a new group together, you're going to go through some parts of this. So you just need to be aware of it and to manage it as it's happening and move the group through to performing as quickly as you can.
Could I comment on this, Larry?
Yep.
This was something that I did some research on, and there's two different kinds of groups. They call them effective groups and ineffective groups, and this actually has a scientific definition. An effective group is a group where if they conduct a test and determine the best performing individual in that group, the group will outperform that individual. And if the group is ineffective, it will actually do worse than the best performing individual in the group. And they did this with puzzles and other things that you know, they use to establish best versus the other performance levels. So if you don't do this process correctly, you can actually make the group performance worse than that of an individual.
Good point. And you will go through these steps. So just become familiar with the different aspects of this and just be ready for it and know that, oh, we're in storming now. Okay. And you just take the group on from there.
When you do a Kaizen, Larry, which is generally, what, 5 days?
It's generally 3 days because we travel Monday and Friday, yeah.
How much time can you do an estimate of how much time you spend in each of these phases? Just a guess? Or is it vary too much?
I'd say the first day we're in storming, and by the second day we're usually into performing. So we get through most of the forming and storming the first day, sometimes the first half of the day. And then typically by the second day we're starting into norming and performing.
Thank you.
Yeah. So how do we keep the meeting on track? Okay, well, you got to have the objectives. So goal and purpose, we do the charter. We put our charter up there. Here's our problem statement. Here's our goal statement, so that everyone knows what it is we're trying to solve. And when we get off track, I'll go back to that problem statement and goal statement and say, does that relate directly to what we're trying to solve here? If not, then it needs to go on the parking lot. We use the parking lot extensively to keep people focused in these meetings. Also capture action items. I'll have a separate piece of paper up there just to capture action items right next to the parking lot, because you want to, if it's pertinent, go ahead and capture it, and then you can stop talking about it. And one of the things that we do is before we let everybody go at the end of the third day, we always go back through all the action items, make sure they're still pertinent, and make sure that they all get assigned. But to capture them and then cut off discussion on that topic so that you can continue to move on. The parking lot is your friend, and once people get used to using that, they will start making suggestions about what you should put on the parking lot. And a lot of times these can end up being additional projects or additional recommendations for management. A lot of good things can come out of the parking lot. So other things to keep the meeting on track, using an agenda. I always have an agenda for my Kaizens, and I send that out before time. And then I continue to use the agenda when we do our follow-up meetings, because the way we do these is we'll meet, we'll pick a place in the country, everybody will fly there, and we'll meet for 3 days. And it's very intensive. And by the end of the 3 days, we've developed our action items, and hopefully we've gotten in to improve and perhaps have a new process drafted out. We have a whole series of action items. The way that you manage those action items after that is we're just doing that with virtual meetings, and you can't manage those action items effectively without an agenda. So you need an agenda for your meetings. You need an agenda for your Kaizen. Defining the ground rules. I always go through the ground rules of here's how we want to interact over the next few days. We're going to take regular breaks. If I don't give you a break soon enough, raise your hand. You tell everybody where the bathrooms is. All the computers are closed. All the phones are put on stun, all of that basic stuff. And then you need to, sometimes in particular groups, you need to have what I call guardrails when the group loses focus. So one of the things would be anybody can raise their hand when they think the group has lost focus to bring that group back into focus. So that gets people focusing on the process that we're going through also. So I find that works pretty well. Time boxing works when you're trying to get some decisions and you can't get them to reach a decision quickly. You put a time box around it and say we've got X number of minutes to reach a decision. Then you take a vote at the end of that, see if they're in agreement. And if they're not, if they can't decide at that point, then it just becomes an action item and thrown on your action item list, and you move on. A lot of times these meetings have a group of people in the room, but we also have people on the phone. So you have to make sure that you include the people on the phone by having the people in the room mention their name before they speak, making sure that you're not getting visual signals that are just in the room, like people nodding their heads and things like that. You need to make sure that people are giving auditory signals so it can be heard on the phone. Make sure that you use the language of the business. One of the things, I'm training a bunch of green belts right now, and one of the things that we're concentrating on is when you go in and you're working with these people, they can easily be intimidated by the words that you use. So you need to be careful about that. And instead of going in and say, okay, we're going to do a force field analysis, say, well, let's look at how this might happen. Let's look at the things that are positive, and let's look at the things that are negative that would keep this from happening. So you want to make sure that you're using terms that they're comfortable with, and that's why I mean language of the business. Confirm the meeting results and next steps. We always go through at the end, go through the action items. What are the next steps going to be? Who's going to be responsible for that? And make sure that everybody agrees before you let them go. So then these are some particular things. I got these off of, I think it's Roy Craybill's website. And these were just some specific things about specific kinds of dialogue and how to deal with that. One of the things that I've done in my career is I've probably read 200 books on attitude, self-image, how to deal with people, human behavior, all those kinds of categories. And whenever I would read one of those books, I would always want to get one item out of that book that I could incorporate into my facilitation to improve my techniques over time. So I would suggest you do the same thing, reading books with behavior books and self-improvement books, and looking to get one thing that'll improve your facilitation. So, but here's some specific things about, like, for generalization, blame, let's see, statements. I've had this happen, wouldn't you agree, where people say, wouldn't you agree with this, trying to drive the conversation in a particular area, and you just need to be aware of that and drive it back to the group in particular, and not supplying your opinion. Some of these that I did a session recently where it was with what we call account management team, and the account managers are like salespeople, and they're very, very competitive. They're competitive in everything that they do. Even when I tell them it's not a competitive activity, they're competitive. And they're very, what is the word? They really ride each other hard. So there's a lot of heavy teasing going on in that group. So I was kind of taken back by this when it first started, but I realized that in order to get this group to perform, I'm going to have to step to their level and do the same kind of teasing, or they're not going to take me seriously. So I just jumped right in there with them on that, and that worked pretty well.
Larry?
Yeah.
This is Peter. I wanted to add something here. A tool I use, I call LCS, which is I've put down as part of the rules at the beginning that you use this LCS approach, which is anytime you're going to say something about something that somebody says in a group, you first have to say what you liked about what they said. That tends to bring that defensive barrier down, that they understood, that they see that you understood what they were trying to say, and then speak of your concern with what they had said, and then always have a suggestion. If you don't have a suggestion for the concern, don't bring up the concern. So it's kind of tell them what you like, tell them your concern and your suggestion for resolving that concern. And it kind of helps move through the thing.
That is an excellent idea. And these kind of tools are always helpful when you can get it, something like that. And that's something that you can easily remember. And you can just put LCS up on the board and then talk to the team about that, and then just remind them, to go to that technique. That's a really good idea. So let me go to the next slide here. There we go. Speaking for others. You got to make sure that people get an opportunity to speak for themselves. So somebody could say something like, I happen to know a lot of other people in the group feel this way. I would say, who feels this way? And let's get all of them to speak. Another thing, number 6 on there, where people say, I think what Mary is really trying to say is, you need to make sure that you let Mary say it, not let somebody else say it for Mary. So those are 2 that I have run across quite a bit in dealing with groups.
I like the phrase super parenting.
Yeah. Yeah. Then interrupting. Interrupting, you just have to, you just call it as it is, and I just typically I would say, I'm interested in what you have to say, but let's let so-and-so finish first, because I think what they're saying is important. And so you need to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to speak, and especially when you have someone who is overly compensating for the group. In other words, they're doing most of the speaking. You need to make sure that everybody doesn't feel like they're being bullied by that person and that they get an opportunity to speak. Because you've got all different kinds of personalities in the room there, so you want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak, because you never know where the gems of wisdom are going to come from. Which
Larry,
go ahead.
Larry, this is Peter. Another thing here is, instead of speaking, sometimes you bring up a discussion point, let everybody write it on a Post-it note, their comments, and then go around the room. That forces everybody to have an opportunity to say what they're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. I use that technique a lot when we're doing brainstorming, actually.
Yeah.
And where you'll use the Post-it notes, and you'll have people write down all of their ideas about how to improve this, for example. And the technique has been shown that people typically write 6 to 8 things, and then once they write the 6 to 8 things that are the normal things to think about, they start thinking outside the box, and that's where you get some of your more creative thinking. And you typically don't get that if you're just having them talk as a group. So that's a good point. Yeah, use that too. And then challenging the facilitator. Sometimes you get that, and you just have to deal with it, and without getting upset. You can't get upset about it. You just have to say, well, I feel uncomfortable with your comments, and I kind of turn it over to the group and try to get the group to weigh in on this. And I've had situations, though, where we have actually had to go back to the sponsor, and we've had to remove a person from the group because we just couldn't get them to play nice in the sandbox, so to speak. So, but bringing the other people into the group, and sometimes, as it happens, I had a group of about 40 people. They were all managers. They were all managers of nurses. And I had one person who was speaking quite a bit for the group. And so at the break, a couple of the people came up to me, and they apologized for that person. And I said, the next time it happens, how about you speak up? And they did. And they basically called that person down and put that person back in their place so that we could continue to make progress. So you can use all of these techniques. This slide, this is some additional information I pulled right out of Tom's handbook about, just covers in general some of the other topics. So the thing that I wanted to point to here is a lot of times when you pull groups together and you're trying to work through a problem, or you'll have people jumping to the solution. And you want to continue to drive people back to the data. What is the data telling us? We don't want to jump to a solution. We want to continue to go back and look at the data. So that's really the one that I wanted to point to on that. But all of these are helpful depending upon the situation that's going on. So the takeaways, keep it on topic, manage the process, and clarify. And clarify throughout the entire session, where you're clarifying to make sure that you have the right operational definitions, you're clarifying to make sure people understand what's going on during the meeting, and then you're clarifying as to what's going to happen after the meeting. And I put this little formula down on the bottom. The solution is equal to the project times the quality of the solution times acceptance. And a good facilitation really helps acceptance. So, and if you don't have acceptance, if acceptance is 0, then your solution is not going to work. So that's, I think that's my last point. Any questions?
So if you have a question and you don't have audio access, you can go ahead and ask the question by clicking the question button, and I will relay that question to Larry. If you do have audio access, you can click the raise hand button, and I will unmute you, and you can ask the question of Larry. I do have a question, Larry.
Okay.
The question is from Doug, and Doug asks, group size is typically 5 to 7 people, but you speak of groups of 40. What is more typical?
Well, 40 was unusual. 5 to 7 is optimal. However, for some of the particular issues that we've had, we've had 17 in a room for 3 days solving a problem. That is a challenge when you're dealing with that many people in a room. So I would always suggest that you do keep it 6 to 8 if at all possible, but sometimes it's just not possible, and you just have to deal with that.
Another question, with large groups, do you bring in more facilitators to help?
Yes, I typically, when you're doing a group that's 40, there's typically 2 of us. And one is watching what's going on in the group while the other one is facilitating. Yeah, that's a great comment. Highly recommend that.
I have a question I'd like to ask.
Okay.
My question is, how do you facilitate a group of your superiors in the organization, your bosses?
Well, I do that all the time, actually. Typically, the COO is in the room, along with several of the vice presidents and my boss. And I don't find it to be any different because they have made it okay for me to be the facilitator and to drive the group wherever the group needs to go. So if you've got an organizational structure, or you've got bosses that don't, it's got something to do with their, I'm having a little trouble with this because I'm having trouble with how to word this, but it's got something to do with their self-image. If they have a good image of themselves, and you can work with that as a group, and people don't worry about being wrong if they realize they have a good self-image. But if people have problems being wrong, if they can't take it if they're wrong, then it's very difficult to facilitate them in a group. They can become very difficult to handle. Does that make sense, Tom?
Yeah, I think it does make sense to me. Let me ask the person who asked the question. Doug, does that make sense to you? Oh, wait, I asked the question. Never mind. Sorry. Yes, it does make sense to me. And the reason I asked is that I'm brought in as a consultant, and it's easier for me. And I do often notice that the employees, if I have co-facilitators for a large group, are always a little bit hesitant and reticent when it comes to addressing their superiors. So I have a question from Santiago. Santiago asks, should the black belt be a facilitator even though the black belt is involved with the results?
We do that here, and my thought on that is, as the black belt, and what I tell my black belts is, you're the facilitator. You are helping the team drive the results, but the results are the results of the team. They're not your results. You may provide some tools to help them get there, but they are identifying and providing the results. And a lot of times these projects will go totally different direction from what I expected or what I thought, my preconceived ideas before coming into the meeting. And you have to let it go there and just support them in getting there, because that's what they'll support. That's what they will sell when they go back. They've created that decision, so they'll be part of your sales team to help implement that.
Okay. We have a question from Dan. Dan asks, do you have tips for dealing with different cultures such as India or the UK?
I have not dealt with the UK, but I've dealt with India. And we had an organization in Bangalore, and we were doing, one of the things that I found out, or that I realized after doing this a couple of times, was that it's very difficult for people in India to tell you that they don't understand. So they will say that they understand even if they don't understand. So what we found was we conducted these sessions. They said that they understood the results, yet when it came down to actually implementing it, we fell down, and we had to go back and redo that. So that's one of the tips that I have for dealing with folks from India. I think it's just a cultural thing. I'm not quite sure exactly why it is that way, but it's just something that I've noticed time and again.
Okay, I'm going to unmute Doug Pearson. Doug has a number of questions he posted, and I'd like to have him ask them live. So Doug, you are unmuted. Go ahead and ask your questions. Oh, Doug says his battery just died. So,
Okay. Read his questions to me then.
Yes. What Doug's question was, if someone takes an HR emergency phone call, do you let them take group time out to bring them back? Do you take group time out to bring them back up to speed, or do you just let them back into the meeting? So I think what he's saying is, you know, somebody gets up, leaves the meeting, answers the phone or takes care of some emergency, and then comes back into the meeting. What do you do in that case, Larry?
It really depends. If possible, I'll just let them come back in and continue on. And then if there's something I need to catch them up on, I'll do it at a break. So I don't want to take the team's time to just bring that other person up to speed. I'll try to use the break for that.
Okay. I have a question here from Ashok, or Ashok, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but he asked, what do you do when one of the team members who is in a senior position starts imposing his way of thinking and decisions on the other team members?
Well, there's a couple. If you can say, look at the data, let's follow the data, let the data tell us where to go. That's one approach. But let's say you're doing an improve, and they're trying to force a particular methodology on the group or a particular thing that the group is not in agreement with. What we do is we will when we're doing the brainstorming, we'll have people vote on the improvement ideas. So if we develop, say, 50 improvement ideas, we'll use multi-voting, and I'll tell them you've got 15 votes, and you can vote 15 votes on one item or one vote on 15 items or anything in between. And what I'm trying to do is to get them to start to stratify what are the most important things that need to be included in our solution. And then what that does is that dilutes that one individual from being overly driving the organization in a particular direction. So what I've done is I've said, okay, now we've got it stratified. We have a subset of our improvement ideas that we're going to make sure that all of these are included in the solutions. So does that answer the question?
I presume so. If not, we'll ask Ashok to Ashok says yes, so there you go.
Okay. Okay, good.
So the next question is from Ali, and Ali asks, how do you engage the people that do not participate because of someone else in the group, but yet they will come back to you after the meeting to engage and say, I did not want to mention this in the room because, and so on?
Well, what I try to do is I don't want that to go until the end of the meeting. I try to do that at the break. So as we take breaks, if I've got somebody who's being overbearing and driving the content of the meeting, and I've got other people in there, I'll either say, I want to hear from every one of you during this hour, or if I take a break and I talk to those people individually that aren't speaking and say, I want you to speak up, I want to hear from you during the next part of the session. You don't want to let it go until the end of the day.
Okay. The next question is from Doug, and Doug says, Black belts facilitate the first 2 or 3 Kaizen events. If they don't go well, what are the next 1 or 2 approaches to use?
If I have an event if I have a black belt whose events are not going well, then I would want to sit in on the next event with them to see what's going on. And typically, when we bring in a new black belt, we pair them up with another black belt for their first couple of projects anyway, because we're in the healthcare arena and we have quite a bit of knowledge that you have to gain in order to be able to move in this environment. So we found that it seems to work better if we pair them up with someone anyway for the first couple of projects. So you kind of get an idea of how they operate, how it works. So if they've had a couple of bad projects, or the sponsor comes back to me and says this didn't work out, then I'm going to be involved in the next one as a fly on the wall and maybe more to try to understand what's going on, what's not working. Hope that helps.
Okay. So I have a question here from Rick, and Rick says, do you have any tips for addressing senior leadership using laptops, emails, phone calls, etc. during the meeting?
That's always a challenge when you're dealing with senior leadership. But what I do is I put it up on the, one of my first slides is no laptops and, phones on stun, and we'll take regular breaks. And if you have people that still continue to leave their laptops open and to work, I'll just kind of walk around the room, and I'll just walk over there and I'll just gently close it while I'm talking. So, and they get the message. And what I typically have, I'm known for that now. So they know that I'm going to publicly embarrass them by closing their laptops. So what they do is they keep them closed, and then they open them at the break, and they answer emails at the break, and then they close them again. But
Right.
you just have to be consistent about that, and you have to let them know as you start the meeting that we need your full attention. We have you at this meeting because we need your brain cells to be involved in the meeting, not involved in answering emails. So
Okay, great.
I'll try to make that point.
So Ashok, I'm going to unmute you, and you can go ahead and ask your question. You're unmuted. Go ahead, Ashok. Did I surprise him? Okay, so I can't hear you, Ashok, so I'm going to assume you're having audio difficulties. You can go ahead and post your question in the chat window, and I'll pass it along to Larry. I'm going to take just a couple more questions here. This one is from Doug, and Doug says, what about electronic notebooks that are becoming more popular? For example, not laptops for business during the meeting.
iPads. We do have people that take notes, and if they tell me I'm just taking notes with my iPad, or I'm just taking notes, and they don't have their email open, I have allowed that in the past. But it's easier with an iPad than it is with having the laptop open.
I have a question from Santiago. He says, when the group is in performing phase, do you think it's also good to move emotions? I'm not sure what he means, but I'll let you answer it, Larry.
To move or remove?
Well, it says move. Santiago, do you mean move or do you mean remove emotions? Move, he says. So, do we know what he means, Larry?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what he means. Anytime you get emotions involved, you have to be objective about that, and you have to deal with it, but you have to try to take the emotion out of it.
He's clarified, Larry. He says to create enthusiasm. That makes sense.
Okay, to create enthusiasm. Yeah, of course you want enthusiasm about the results, and you typically, when you're getting into the improve phase and people are starting to see that they are part of a solution and that solution can actually occur, then they're starting to get some enthusiasm about that, and you do want to build on the enthusiasm.
Okay. So at this point, I'm going to turn off the questions, and I want to thank Larry for delivering a presentation. It was a great job, Larry. I'm going to be posting the link to the recording later on today on the site sixsigmatraining.org, all spelled out. And you can stop up there and see the recording as well as the Q&A. And I want to thank everybody for attending. And hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar. And special thanks to Larry and Pete Bersbach, our panelists. So thank you, everyone.